Good afternoon. My name is Verna Lavender and I am the Head of Nursing for Research and Education in Cancer and Surgery at Guy's and St Thomas's. And this session is for all staff, but there are some links in it that are specifically for nursing and midwifery staff, but I think it'll be of use for everyone. And this is to talk about how we go about applying for research funding. And just to put on everyone's radar some of the funding sources that are available. So just a bit of housekeeping first of all. So we are recording this webinar, and if there's anything that I say during the presentation, please do kind of either pop into the chat if you've got any questions and I'll answer them at the end, or make a note of them and ask me at the end of the presentation about them. A couple of times I will close the window so we can have some opportunity for discussing if you've got any questions. If you can put your microphones on mute for the time being, unless you're asking a question. I'm not able to see anybody at the moment, so please do feel free, if you've got cameras, to switch those off whilst I'm presenting, but it would be great if you've got cameras and you're for questions, if you can turn those on. So it would be great to see you. So there's also the raised hand function, but again, whilst I'm presenting, if you've got a question, you can unmute yourself to ask it, or I will be available for you to ask it at the end, and we'll have some opportunity for discussion after the presentation. So in terms of aims, the aims of this workshop are to develop an awareness of the process of applying for research funding, to learn about different types of research funding that are available, to learn about where to look for funding opportunities, to know the importance of the grant application guidelines, and that's really key. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Understand the grant application review process and the timelines involved. Applying for research funding is something that takes a long time to do, so you really need to factor in a kind of reasonable timeline for applying for funding. And quite often, if funds are announced on a regular basis, you'll kind of have a good idea about what time of year the funding call comes out, so you can start planning well in advance of the funding call. Find out where to get seek help and support, and there's lots of support available within the trust for supporting non-medical led research for people that are in roles that haven't traditionally necessarily applied for funding, but are wishing to do their own research and apply for funding to take their research projects forward. So all research projects start with a research question or a hypothesis. So it might be exploratory, or it might be trying to test if intervention is feasible, or it might be that there has been some evidence generated, or there's a very good argument for conducting some interventional research. You kind of have your question and your hypothesis and your hunches, and the first thing you do is you want to discuss those with peers. So discussing, is this a good question? Is anyone doing this? Does anyone know about any work that's going on? If I'm thinking about approaching this research in this way using a particular methodology, what do people think about that? And so quite early on, starting to sort of group together a small group of experts that can give you a good steer and some advice. And it's usually very early on that you would want to develop either a project steering group or bring together a team of people that either want to work with you as co-applicants or might potentially be collaborators in an application. The next thing you need to do is to make sure that the question that you're going to ask, or the hypothesis you want to test, hasn't been asked before or hasn't been tested before, and you can only do that if you look at the published literature and you do a fairly comprehensive review of the literature and you scope publications on the topic. Doing a literature review will also inform you about the types of methods and methodology that have been used before for asking these sorts of questions and doing this type of research. It can also give you a steer of the sorts of outcome measures that you might want to use to be able to look for differences if you are trialing an intervention. And it can also give you information about the sorts of theory that you might want to use to underpin how you frame your research and your research question. And it will certainly give you an idea about what gaps there are in the literature and in the evidence base and where you might want to undertake research to address those gaps. As I said, you'll start discussing with peers and they might suggest to you, well, I don't know, but I do know someone that knows a bit more about this or is interested in this or has published in this or presented at a conference about it and can give you their contact details. The other thing that you purpose of doing a literature review is you might find an author that's published about the topic on a number of occasions, and it may be that you want to email them and discuss with them if they would be interested in working with you to conduct research as either a co-applicant or a collaborator. The key thing to do at this stage before you put pen to paper and start applying for funding is to agree amongst the team that are going to form the group of researchers who's going to have what role and what responsibilities they have, who will be doing what if the funding, to apply for the funding, and then when the funding is won, and who will be in what order. So who would be the lead applicant, who would be co-applicants, who might be collaborators or other applicants. And if you're going to be publishing the work, which you should be thinking about doing once it's completed, what sort of publications might there be, and who would you think that would be the first author and the lead author on those publications? And it's really helpful to stop any conflicts in the future, and certainly to kind of prevent alienating your colleagues when you're doing research, if you can just agree those things up front. So you've got a good idea about what your research question or hypothesis is. You've got a team around you that are knowledgeable about either the topic, the methodology, a method, or both. And you've got a good idea about what's been published from looking at the evidence in the literature. So you're in a good position now to write your research proposal or your research protocol. So there are standard templates for writing research proposals and protocols. They always include who the team are, the date, the version control, the background, the aims, objectives, the methods, risks, benefits, the timeline, so a Gantt chart, the project plan, and details about the funding that's needed. So that's the kind of research protocol, research proposal. That will allow you to have a good document to refer to for everything else in the study going forward. So not just funding application, but also if you're applying for ethics, it helps you with completing research ethics applications. If you're going to, when you come to writing, publishing your work in the future, you can refer to the protocol. And it's also good practice to submit your protocol for publication. So there are websites where you can submit your protocol for publication. You should identify some patient-public partners, so that might be patients or carers. And ideally you want people who I've got experience of the topic that you are focusing on, but you also want to have as diverse a representation as you can with your patient and carer partners. And probably you'll have for a small to medium-sized project, you'll have 2 or 3 patient public partners that will join the steering group for the project. And then are there any other stakeholders? Are there key stakeholders? So are there key people in senior positions that you need to be champions, that you need to help you get through gatekeepers, or that will be representing the study site that you need to be working with. So think about all the people that might be impacted by the type of work that you're doing that's outlined in the protocol, and make sure that you've got all of the relevant people around the table in developing a stakeholder group. Think about methodological experts. So it may be that within your study team that you've put together, you've got people that've got methodological expertise, but it may be that you want to try a type of method and nobody on the team has used that before. And if that's the case, then do make sure that one of your co-applicants is somebody that's used the method before and published about that method, so that you are showing the funders when you apply for money that the team includes somebody that's got methodological expertise. You're then at a point where you can seek funding opportunities. So we'll have a look at those in a moment and the different types of funding opportunity there are. But make sure that you know the timelines, because you need to plan well in ahead to be able to make sure that you meet the submission deadline. So once you've identified the funding opportunity, put dates in diaries and start working towards those timelines. The key thing is using the guidelines. So when a funding call is made, it will say what the scope of the call is for, who's eligible to apply for it. So that might be organisations or types of individuals, so professional groups, or people with certain levels of experience or certain levels of qualification. For example, it might be applicants can come from NHS trusts or charitable organisations. They need to be either a medic or a non-medical health professional. They need to have a PhD. They need to have won previous funding. So it's always helpful that you do that and you look at that first, and then you think that's not this project or that's not me. Then you know not to put any more effort into that funding. You also want to make sure that the topic fits with the guidelines. So the guidelines will also always say, what is the strategic priority to be addressed, or what topic is suitable to be researched. So have a look and see what the guidelines say about the type of area of research. And they will also say the type of research. So they might say, the guidelines might say, oh, it won't fund any exploratory research, or it will not fund a feasibility study. So again, have a look at that and see what the guidelines say about what funding can be applied for. What's the timeline? So how long's the funding available? There's no point in applying for funding that's just for 12 months if you know the study will take 3 years. So you need to think about that. The level of funding. So thinking about what can you reasonably and realistically do with the funding that's available, and will your project fit within that funding envelope? If you've got a project that you know is going to be more expensive than the maximum amount of funding available, then again, that would be a reason that you wouldn't pursue that funding call. And then follow the guidelines. The guidelines will give very detailed information about the sections. Often they'll tell you the word count, that's the maximum word count in the sections, how many references that you can include. So make sure that you go through and you get all information from that. If you've got any queries, having read the guidelines really thoroughly, and you're still not quite sure whether your project might fit the eligibility criteria, there's always contact details. So do contact the funder if you've got any queries at all, and they usually respond very quickly if you put in an expression of interest in applying for some funding, but you're not quite sure you're meeting the criteria for various reasons. They usually come back fairly quickly with some guidance and a response to that. You need to fairly early on contact finance and start working up costing. So that's something that if you've not applied for funding before, you're going to want some support with. So you'll probably want to work with somebody who is experienced at applying for research funding and can give you a steer about the sorts of things you should be costing in and what they, the ballpark figure, but you certainly need to be working with finance to getting accurate costings, and funders will want accurate costings. And be mindful of the fact that working with finance, you're really going to need to allow 4 to 6 weeks to get that information from finance, because your application for funding is not going to be at the top of their workload list. You then need to get trust sign off, and that again can take up to several weeks to get trust sign off. So as soon as you know that you're going to be applying for funding, let the person that has to sign it off for the trust, so it might be someone, for example, like Professor Suzanne Bench, let them know straight away that you're intending to apply, that you're going to be seeking their sign off, the date when their sign off is going to be needed by, so that they can make sure they've got time in their diary to manage your application well ahead of the submission deadline. And then develop a schedule for submitting, so you don't miss the timeline because you've left it too late and it's all a bit of a scramble and you don't put in a good quality application. You're better off not putting an application in at all and waiting for the next call than putting in a poor quality application. So lots of different types of funding are available. So commercial funding is funding that comes from an organisation that's a manufacturer, and they might be a pharmaceutical company manufacturing medicine, or they might make medical devices, or it may be they develop apps like healthcare apps, and quite often commercial funding is the sort of funding that comes into the NHS to pay for interventional research, such as you find within a randomized control trial. Occasionally, people might have PhD studentships that are supported by commercial funding if they're working on a particular research project that the company want done, or they might support joint funding with a university for someone to do a PhD. But most often, commercial funding that comes into the NHS is to put some funding into teams that work in clinical trial units for the conduct of randomized controlled trials. So most of the funding for non-medical research, so nurse-led research, midwifery-led research, AHP-led research is non-commercial. And the funding comes from a whole variety of sources. So it might be that it's a charity, it might be a local charity. So we have, for example, the Guys and St Thomas's charity. There's also the charity for the Guy's Cancer, and there's a charity for Evelina. It might be that it's a charity that's local, so it might be to a kind of region, or it might be a national charity. And my background is as a cancer nurse, so one of the main charities that I've worked with throughout my lifetime is Macmillan Cancer Support. I've also worked with Cancer Research UK. So it might be it's a charity for a particular disease type. So something like the British Heart Foundation or Alzheimer's UK, or the Lymphoma Trust, or Bowel Cancer UK. So there's a whole lots of different disease-specific charities which might have funding available. One of the key funders for research within the NHS is the National Institute for Health and Care Research. So the National Institute for Health and Care Research have got a dedicated programme for nursing and midwifery research, and they're developing, going forward, they're developing a programme for AHP research, but they fund fellowships. So they have research programmes. So there are things like research for patient benefit, for example, and then they have fellowship programmes. So they have for individuals to apply for. So things like the pre-doctoral clinical academic fellowship or the doctoral clinical academic fellowship. So that's the PCAF and the DCAF awards. They have postdoctoral fellowships. So they've got development funds. And they've also got, I'm on an NIHR fellowship at the moment, which is the Senior Research Lead Fellowship. So there's a whole host of fellowships for professionals throughout their career to support them in conducting and continuing to be involved in research. So as well as NIHR, there are other fellowships and internships available. So here at Guy's and St Thomas's, we have a centre of research for nursing and midwifery, and they have a research internship programme that runs annually, and it's on its third cohort. So that's led by Professor Suzanne Bench and run by Alessandro Borca. And we also work collaboratively with local universities, so King's College London, London South Bank University, for example, to support fellowship awards as well. So things like Masters of Research fellowships. So there are opportunities as well to get funding to support people to have time and also education to develop their research knowledge, skills and experience. And then there are studentships. So the classic example is doctoral studentships, a PhD, and studentships are offered by universities, and they're often offered a little bit like a job would be offered, and you apply for it, and you would attend it, you'd be selected and attend an interview, and alongside other candidates, the successful candidate would be successful in being offered the PhD studentship. So these mostly full-time, they can be part-time. The disadvantage of a PhD is the funding support if you do a full-time PhD is through a bursary, and at the moment in the UK the bursary is around £18,600 a year, which is usually a significant drop for most health professionals. So that's why the NIHR is more appealing, because if people win funding to do their PhD through an NIHR doctoral clinical academic fellowship, it backfills your salary. But that's also why NIHR DCAF awards are so competitive and so difficult to win, but they're worth going for that reason. It might also be that a PhD is funded jointly between an NHS organisation and a university, or jointly between a charity and a university, or jointly between a commercial company and a university. But if you do a PhD, then your kind of host organisation would be the university. So in terms of funding opportunities, I've spoken about ACORN, and there's lots of information. I'll go onto these websites in a moment. There's lots of information on the ACORN website, on the intranet, about research career development, and ACORN is specifically for nurses and midwives, but there are research career development information there which might be useful for other professional groups. I mentioned the charities, so the example is the Guys at St Thomas's charity. So other charities that you might not have heard of, if you're a nurse, there's the Burdett Trust for Nursing, and the Burdett Trust advertise, they put out funding calls for research and for small grant programs, and they advertise those grant programs. And the RCN Foundation also put out calls for small research grants and funding for doing project work and funding research modules and attendance at research conferences and so on. NIHR, as I mentioned, find a PhD. So if we were looking for a job in the NHS, we might go on to nhs.jobs. So if you're interested in finding a PhD, this is the site where all of the PhDs are listed. So find a PhD, list the PhDs currently advertised in the UK. And then there's the UK Research and Innovation group. So they have a website, and that lists all of the grants that are available, not just nationally, but internationally. And these are usually project and program grants. And if you can find something at UK Research and Innovation that fits your brief, then it's great that you've got that opportunity to apply for that funding. But sometimes the eligibility criteria is very tight and quite restricted in the funding that's advertised on this site, but it's worth knowing about. So I'm just going to unshare, and hopefully this will unshare, and then I will try resharing. I'm just going to close down my, just closing down my PowerPoint, and hopefully I will then be able to share with you the website. We can look at the websites. My Teams was playing up earlier, so I'm hoping it will let me do this. Hopefully you can see these websites that I've just clicked on. So I'm just going to go first of all onto the intranet, and this is the page that I was showing the link for earlier. So it's part of the ACORN pages, and it's on research career development. So what it does is it lists. So I've been talking about some of these research opportunities, and so these are listed on the ACORN website. So rather than having to go and have a look at lots of different sites, if you just click on this web page for ACORN, you'll find about lots of different funding opportunities that are available. So let's just look at those. So the UK RI I mentioned to you before, it's a national competition for clinical academic research partnerships. And so, you know, that's something that would be open for everyone to look at. NIHR, the DSE, is a postdoctoral development award, so people have completed their PhD, and it supports them to have time out and some research costs and conference attendance costs. There's fellowships of postdoctoral clinical academics through King's Health Partners, so between KCH and Guy's and St Thomas's and KCL. So we're part of the King's Health Partners, so we can apply for opportunities then when they get announced. Joint funding with the NIHR and the Academy of the Medical Royal College of Physicians. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of NIHR funding, but also other charitable funding, so Wellcome Trust, and then research, so other charities like Cancer Research UK, Kidney Research UK, Diabetes UK, Alcohol Change. I mentioned the British Heart Foundation. So, and I've mentioned Macmillan Cancer Support. So you can see there's lots of places where you can look for opportunities for funding. The Burdett Nursing Trust is one of the links that I mentioned, and this is their website. And you can see that they have calls that come out. So the last call that they put out last year was around high impact cardiovascular disease interventions. So really focused call, but it's worth looking at that and keeping your eye out for Burdett Trust just in case it's something of interest to you. The RCN Foundation, so again, research grants, and it will give you a kind of an idea about what the priorities are. So at the moment, there's funding for people that work with children's and young people's mental health, or people that work with nursing, learning disability nursing. So So again, a very focused call, but worth knowing about to keep an eye on. The NIHR is really key. So there are some calls that come that are very targeted. So this is, giving you an idea of very targeted calls. But as said, they also do have the calls that are around fellowships. So worth knowing about that. phd.com. So find a phd.com. So what you do is you just go in there and you put in the topic of where you're searching for a PhD, and you look for that, and it will come up with relevant PhD opportunities. And again, UKRI, you put in a search. So I'm just going to put in cancer as a search, just as an example, and it will hopefully it will come up for us. It will come up with a list of relevant PhD relevant funding opportunities that you might want to look at applying for. So those are some of the organisations that provide research funding. Okay, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's unshare. So I'm just going to go back to the slides. So just really talking about the application guidelines. So as I said, they provide information about the funding organisation, the type of funding that's available, the research priorities or the specific topic that the research needs to address, who's eligible to apply, what funding's available, the timelines that people are working to, information on how to complete the application form, how to submit the application, and contact details if you've got any queries. So the research applicant guidelines, I'll just see if I can open that a moment. And I have to unshare and share, so hang on a moment. Just unshare that. Share this. Switching between screens. So this is an example of some research applicant guidelines. So this was a call that came out recently across London, and it says, who can apply, what the topic of research, what's got to be focused on, the eligibility, what funding's available and over what period of time, and who to contact, and information about how to apply. So the timeline that you're working to. So these guidelines are really brief. Sometimes you have guidelines that can be, maybe 20 pages long, depending on the level of the research funding that you're applying for and how in depth the application needs to be. But I'll just give you a sense of the guidelines. The other guidelines that you can refer to are those that have been created by the team at ACORN. These are guidelines about how you manage a research fellowship or a funding, research funding once you've got it. So this is really helpful because it also includes in it some guidelines about going about applying for, specifically about applying for fellowship funding. So these are available on the ACORN pages on the intranet. So about how do you select the right supervisor, referees, mentors, how do you kind of manage the clinical element of your workload alongside doing research, how does it all get costed up, how do you get sign off. So there's quite a lot of detailed information there, which I've summarised earlier on in my talk today. So these are really helpful to sort of steer you through applying for fellowship funding. And as I said, they're on ACORN. Okay. So let's just go back to presenting. So I've referenced ACORN, but as well as ACORN, within each of the clinical groups at the Trust, there is a nurse or a midwife research lead. So for cancer and surgery clinical group, the research lead for nurse-led research is me. And I hold a weekly clinic. So it's worth finding out, depending on the clinical group you work in, who's your research lead, if you're a nurse or a midwife, and if you're an allied health professional. Also just find out, you know, who it is in your clinical group that can you can get some support and advice from in terms of starting your research career or applying for research funding. I've mentioned ACORN, so this again is just to sort of flag up the support. So ACORN is there to provide support and grow research activity across the whole trust. And there's a number of offers that ACORN provides. So they also provide research clinics. They have a doctoral support group. They have a nurse science meeting, and they have a regular research cafe, as well as this seminar program. So there's lots of support that people can seek from ACORN. Because we're part of King's Health Partners, we also have support from King's Health Partners through the King's Clinical Academic Training Office, which is called CATO. And they provide a lot of support, and they particularly provide information. They have online learning, training opportunities, workshops, and can help people skill up in areas of research skill that are yet to be developed. So it's also worth looking on CATO to see what opportunities that they've got available to. And again, through the NIHR, there used to be a service called RDS, the Regional Development Service, but it's been retitled as the NIHR Research Support Service, and this is regional. So we have this for the London Regional Support Service. And again, if you're applying for funding, if you need some support, particularly around things like identifying patients and partners to help work with you, or if you want to get someone to review an application or give you some pointers, or you want to find out if you're applying for fellowship funding, for example, and ask you what your training plan is, you can speak to the research support service as well. So it's sort of great resource. So what happens once you've submitted your application and you've applied for your funding? So so there are a number of things that occur after you submit your application, and it's nice to think that, oh, you've submitted your application and you know, that's the end of that funding application, but in a way there's a whole process to go through. So you should receive a confirmation email, and I would say if you submitted a funding application and you don't have a confirmation email back that day or the next day, then email the funders just to make sure that they have received your submission, particularly if it's really close to the deadline. Sometimes something goes wrong with submission. It's happened to me before, and you submit something, or at least you think you have, and you haven't had a confirmation email, and then I followed it up the next day and said, well, I haven't had confirmation, and I hadn't received my application for whatever reason. I suppose the other thing to say about that is when you submit, quite often you upload a document and then you OK, and then you have to scroll right to the bottom of the page to submit. So sometimes it's quite easy to miss the submit button as well. So make sure that you follow the instructions for submission of the application to the T. Your application will be initially screened to say, does it meet the eligibility criteria? And if it does, it will then be shared with experts to conduct peer review. So this is an expert review, And normally applications will be blind reviewed. So that means that the reviewers will independently review them and not know what other reviewers have said about them. They won't know who the applicant is or who any of the co-applicants are. So normally they would have all of the identifying information about the applicant removed. They don't know what anyone else has said about it, and they independently review the application, and then they will respond to a number of questions that the funding body will ask the reviewer to respond to. So about the scientific importance, the scientific rigor, the value for money, whether it's a reasonable timeline, and so on and so forth. What's the nature of the expertise on the panel? Are they appropriate for the proposed project? Once it's been through expert review, it will often then go through patient and public involvement review. So invariably, research councils or research funding bodies will have patient and carer stakeholder members who will also review the application from a lay summary perspective, both in terms of its ease of being able to, readability, but also about whether they think that that's a valuable thing to do, and particularly if it's funding that comes from initially from an NHS source, whether that's good spend of taxpayers' money. So that's a kind of another thing that gets answered. It then goes to a grant panel. So the experts will review it, the PPI will review it, and then go to a grant panel. And at the grant panel, everyone comes together. So the funders, the experts, and the patient and carer representatives will all come together and review the application and discuss it. And then it will either be shortlisted or it'll be rejected. Now, sometimes it's shortlisted and an offer is made. So you just have one round of going through a grant panel, and the funding application is either successful and the funding's awarded, or it's rejected. And if it's rejected, most often you'll be able to submit to that funder again. If you can't, then the funder will come back to you and say they won't accept the application for that project again. And that'll be really clear in the rejection letter. And sometimes that happens, particularly with small charities. Well, if they've received something and they think it doesn't quite meet their strategic aims and they'll reject the application, they'll say, please don't apply to us again, but wish you good luck with finding funding elsewhere. If it's something like NIHR, then you will be able to apply for the funding again. And sometimes if you apply for funding for the same project, there'll be a maximum number of times that you could apply for that funding before you're no longer eligible to apply from it. So that's sort of rejection or success. But more common is that you will have stages of application, and at least 2 stages. So it may well be that if you're successful at the first grant panel, rather than being awarded the funding, instead what will happen is you'll be shortlisted. And so you'll be invited to submit a further application, which will be a fuller application with more detail, which will address any concerns or issues that have been highlighted as feedback from the grant review panel, and give you an opportunity to amend and correct those before submission at stage 2. So you then submit at stage 2, and it may be that at stage 2 you're called for an interview, or it might be at stage 2 it goes back to the grant panel again for a final decision. There may or may not be opportunity to respond to reviewers' comments, but you should have had reviewers' comments following the first grant panel to be able to submit the amended application. But sometimes at stage 2, it's not responding to any comments. They just invite you to submit a fuller and more detailed application that's got a higher word count. So then it goes through the second stage. So it's either interviews, the second stage, or another grant panel. And then there's a decision made to either reject or offer the award at stage 2, so you get success. And if you're successful, you then go through a period of contract signing, transfer of money, and that can take several months, and then the hard work really begins. So time between submitting and getting your funding is certainly several months, and it might be a year from the point of submission of the funding to the point of having the funding and being able to start doing the work. But again, that's why you'll want a mentor who's got experience in applying for that type of funding to be able to work with you, so they can advise you accordingly on the sort of timeline that you might be thinking about. But it's quite usual to think about, okay, if I want to apply for funding and I know that the funding deadline's next June, I'm going to be working on it now because it will take me at least 6 months. A good application, really, you should be working on 12 months, 9 months before the submission deadline, and hopefully you'll definitely start working on 6 months before. And it may be that the submission is in June, and then the process of going through stage 1 and stage 2 takes until December, and then the award might be made in the next April, but the funding might not come into a cost centre until July. So if you think about it reasonably, it's not unusual for applying for funding for it to take 2 years before you're actually in receipt of it, when you can actually start doing the work. Smaller awards tend to have shorter time frames, but certainly larger awards have a longer time frame. And again, knowing about the types of projects and the sorts of timelines that you're working towards, because it does vary with application to application, is really key that you get support and advice early on, and you identify a mentor that's applied for funding previously, hopefully successfully applied for previous funding, so that they can help steer you through the process. So that's the presentation. I'm going to close that now, but just thank you for listening. Those are my contact details. If you want to contact me, if you work in cancer and surgery, I'm your clinical group research lead for nursing. But if you're not sure who it is, please do contact ACORN, and they can let you know the leads for the other clinical groups within the trust and steer you in the right direction.